Greetings, friends. Juan Angrisky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War for the week of March 4th through March 10th of 2024. And this week we have some updates, so let's go over what is going on in this war in Ukraine. So this week there's actually been a bit of a slowdown in operations because the Ukrainians are throwing the kitchen sink at Avdiivka. There's been a lot, we talked about this in the last two videos, for the last month. After the collapse of Avdiivka, the Russians are making fast progress in relation to the progress we usually see in this war. And this would have threatened a lot of, would have created a big vulnerability. And the Ukrainians need to send reserves to help build their next lines of defense. This is what they did, for example, after the Russians gave, after the Russians took Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, for example. The Ukrainians built a new defense line in Seversk and Bakhmut, which is why taking Bakhmut was a lot harder than usual because they built up the defenses around this town, for about a year after the fall of these cities. So, the slow grinding allows the Ukrainians to, build a new defense line just a couple kilometers behind where the Russians just took. However, the Russians did not stop. They continued advancing, and that was key. Because if the Russians continued advancing as they were, then there would have not been enough defensive lines prepared here to help stop that Russian push. So they needed to prevent the Russians from continuously advancing, and they need to build now they're quickly trying to build a new defense line. So they're sending a lot of reserves. We saw already 5 Abrams tanks burned up in Berezhishi, in this village right here. We are seeing, the Ukrainians trying to diffuse Russian advantages and fabs by bringing up all their long-range, artillery systems, their anti-aircraft systems. We saw, for example, the destruction of a Patriot battery and launcher somewhere to the west of Pokrovsk, around this area. We saw the destruction of another, the SAM's anti-aircraft system in Kherson. We saw the defeat of an IRIS-T anti-air defense system near the Bakhmut front. So we saw the defeat of an S-300 anti-aircraft system. I forgot where, but we're seeing and then we also saw the first confirmed HIMARS kills. We've seen rumors of those before. We've seen some videos that weren't clear, but for the first time ever, we saw the first confirmed HIMARS kills, destruction in Donbass as well. I think it was somewhere, I believe here somewhere. So the Ukrainians are risking their limited anti-aircraft, anti-air systems, their long-range artillery systems, and they are throwing some of their reserve units. For example, the ones with Abrams tanks did not, those were part of a small package that, part of their strategic reserves, and they are using those strategic reserves with those Abrams tanks to try to hold the front to the west of Avdiivka as much as possible. The Russians are still pushing everywhere. But this has slowed down the Russians, and this has, this gives Ukraine time to start building new defenses. But again, Ukraine needs to if they need to get, hundreds of thousands of new bodies in uniforms. They need to get, $100 billion worth of aid more to get more equipment. They are running out of equipment, they're running out of manpower, and they're using as much as they can to help delay the time so that they could hopefully get some more manpower and equipment in a later time so that they could, it's kind of like, the way I would describe it is paying for a credit card, like paying for things with your credit card, right? Right now, you are in debt, but that paying things for credit could pay off if that credit leads you to make more money in the future, so that you could pay off what you spent in the present for a bigger gain in the future. Because having that money right now, spending it now, gives you a bigger payoff in the future. The Ukrainians are hoping to spend their reserves, spending their equipment to help halt the Russians, so that they could buy themselves time to build these defense lines, to mobilize hundreds of thousands of more people, and hopefully get more to get about $100 billion worth of aid from the EU and America. And so they're hoping that basically if they slow down the Russians, that will, that aid and manpower will come, and then since they slow down the Russians, there's not going to be a big hole in their defense. They spent all of it, but they got more equipment so they could continue holding. However, it becomes horrible if they don't get that equipment, if they don't get that hundreds of thousands of extra manpower to help replenish their reserves. Otherwise, in that case, then they just spent all their reserves. They spent their life savings. these systems and these reserves they're sending in are their their life savings in case of like a breakthrough. They could try to patch up like a serious breakthrough. So let's see if it pays off for the Ukrainians. It's a bold strategy. So let's continue going on the details of what's happening on the ground, though. So this was in this area. This is where a lot of the action's happening, and this is basically the war. This was the week of the Ukrainian counterattacks. And let's go over what's happening. So basically, on the front line has in this area. There's only been some small change. That is because the Russians are on the defensive and the Ukrainians are on the offensive. What happened? One of the biggest gains the Ukrainians got is that while the Russians were pushing into Berdichi, they were they were in control of the majority of this village about a week or two ago. However, the Ukrainians sent a lot of reserves from Chechnya and started moving down this way to attack Berdichi. Because if Berdichi falls and Orlovka continues holding, then one of the last holdouts, Semivka, would have been crushed on two sides. Along with this, holding Berdichi and holding this area right here gives the Russians a very powerful spring point to go towards the second line of defense. And I'm going to go over what these lines of defense are in a moment, but let's talk about what's happening. So the Ukrainians went on the attack, and they pushed the Russians out of the center of Berdichi. The Russians are still in control of the eastern part of Berdichi. If we look at Rybar's map of this. This is the pro-Russian Rybar of his viewpoint of where the Ukrainians are in Berdichi. So he also has them on the western, on the eastern outskirts of Berdichi. So the Russians have a foothold still in Berdichi. However, if we look at so this area with these small little towns is under Russian control. However, the center part of the village is under Ukrainian control. Not to mention kind of this gully right here, these kind of tree lines right here. That the Russians need to occupy. So the Russians were in the process of clearing Berdichi. However, the Ukrainians pushed them back, and now the Ukrainians control about 2/3 of the village, while the Russians control about 1/3, mostly in these outskirts. However, this is where the Ukrainians are using their Abrams tanks. Basically, the Berdichi is known as the Abrams graveyard because 5 Abrams tanks have been destroyed, visually confirmed destroyed here. So the Ukrainians are using their strong reserves to hold back the Russians from taking this village. This is a very important village, as we see with the Ukrainians. So it has delayed the Russians from capturing this village. They have a little bit of a foothold in the western part. However, the Ukrainians have managed to basically hold the center part of the village. So while the Russians were on course to take it, now it's being contested. So that was one thing. The Ukrainians delayed the capture of Berdichi. The advance in Orlovka has basically stayed the same. The Russians are basically holding along this reservoir. And basically the center, so the Orlovka is in a situation where about 85% of the town is under, or the village is under under Russian control, and then there's some houses on the most western outskirts, right on this, right next to this river type thing right here. And so this area right here is not necessarily under Ukrainian control, but the Russians are having a hard time trying to fully establish themselves here because the Ukrainians are on the other side here. They're sending continuously counterattacks to try to squeeze into Orlovka itself. However, the Russians are still holding on to this important center of the Ukrainian defense. So Orlovka, the advance. So unlike in Berdichi, the Russians didn't take more of Orlovka. The only difference was that they prevented the Ukrainians from taking any more. So this is the Ukrainians are on the attack here as well. However, the Russians have been holding them back using this kind of natural water barrier that has prevented the Russians from entering Semivka, but it also helps the Russians in defending Orlovka. So Ukrainians managed to take back Berdichi. The Russians managed to take most of Berdichi. However, the Russians were able to hold off the Ukrainians in Orlovka. Now, another thing that was happening is in the village of Toninka. Now, Toninka, like Orlovka, is about 80% under Russian control. However, this was not always the case. The Ukrainians were also using their reserves to try to take back Toninka. And in the last week, they actually managed to take back the center of the village here. The Russians managed to occupy. You could probably see like kind of this this kind of tip of Tonica. Tonica's kind of like built in a weird way. It's built different, but this kind of like edge here of the like this edge right here is was under Russian control, and the center was, they were occupying most of Tonica, and then the Ukrainians came and tried to occupy the center of the town, and they did. But however, the Russians managed to use their defenses in Orlovka right here, and since they were able to hold Orlovka, they managed to advance along these kind of like water reservoirs and attack Tonica from the north, down here. So not only did Tonica get assaulted from the east, they got assaulted from the north. And this rapidly, by the end of the week, the Russians managed to control the center of Tonica. The Ukrainians still hold positions in like kind of the more western towns, right, like houses right here. Same thing in Orlovka. So while the villages of Orlovka and Tonica are not 100% under Russian control, they are still they're mostly under Russian control. So the Ukrainians but as we can see though, the Russians are holding their own. They are they're not getting pushed back to Avdiivka. But the Ukrainians have managed to halt the major Russian advances. We did not see, I was thinking, if you told me last week what the progress would be, I'm like, maybe the Russians have a chance of taking the first line of Ukrainian defense. However, Ukrainians have managed to delay that. One thing I want to show about this front, because that's the rest of Avdiivka, is actually, if you look at, let's go to my profile here. If we look at these things right here, here's like a little bit of a thing I've had here. So if we look at it, this red line is the first line of Ukrainian defense that they set up, Berdichi to Tonica. Already most of this line is already compromised. So the Ukrainians are trying to hold with all their might this red line. And I think they already gave up this red line because they're like, okay, the Russians already occupy most of it, but they don't want to quickly collapse it. They want to hold this red line until they could build the second Ukrainian defense line, which is this yellow line. This runs through Novobakhnivka to Peremyska. It uses the Vochachka River and basically uses these strings of villages as a natural defense point. And the Russians, if they want to complete their operational goal of pushing Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk, need to basically reach this yellow line. Basically, once the Russians reach this yellow line, and this is the new front line for the Russians, then the Russians have completed their operational mission in pushing the Ukrainians away from Donetsk in the northern sector. And basically, the third Ukrainian defense line is basically running along this kind of railroad right here with Orchechny, Nova Kalinova, and then it kind of goes along this rail line. And then they would also use the Vochachka River on the other side, connecting right in this blue river as like another. This would be like the third Ukrainian defense line. But they really want to hold the yellow line because then this allows them to still have some presence near Avdiivka. So they really don't want the Russians to start fighting for this yellow defense line. And in order to do that, they want to build up the defenses here. So they're trying to fight for this red line. The red lines, I think, almost is said like it's all said and done. It's like all, it's over for them. It's this is basically just only a delaying game, and the Russians will take this red line. But it will be seen that have the Ukrainians gave them enough time to prevent the Russians from taking this yellow line? I mean, that's a big question. It's not set in stone that the Russians will take this yellow line. So the Russians could take this red line and then stop, and then just regroup, and then the Ukrainians will just build a new defense line, this yellow line. But this is kind of like what the Ukrainians are trying to fight for this red line to, they're going to give this up, but they're hoping to give them enough time to be able to hold this yellow line. So that's kind of the things happening in Avdiivka. We're also seeing some progress near Peremyska. Again, small progress. It's very hard to know. So this is the center of the town. But the southern part of the town, kind of the more eastern part, we're always seeing a small little gain. We always see some more geolocated footage of where exactly the Russians are on this one-way street, because then it enters the center part of the town, which is under Ukrainian control. But we don't know exactly how far away from the center of the town the Russians are. So this week we saw the Russians be a little bit more closer to the center of the town. But it's hard to basically advance along this one street, especially since the Ukrainians still hold on to the open fields right here. So if they try to advance towards the center of Peremyska, they could be attacked on the side. So that also inhibits Russians trying to take Peremyska. However, this is another point with taking, let's say they reach the second line of Ukrainian defense and go up against the Vochachka River, then they could attack Peremyska from the north here and basically be able to collapse it. So it'll be a lot more easy if they take the second Ukrainian defense line. This has ramification effects. The Ukrainian defenses here would be a lot more at risk if they take the second Ukrainian defense line. This is why the Ukrainians are obviously, as I mentioned, trying to prevent that. So some small advances of the Russians towards the center of Peremyska. Let's go to another area where they're trying to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk in the South Donetsk direction. This week, the Russians are still battling for the battle for Krasnogorivka has begun. The Russians have a very they're using their new Fab 1500s to bomb kind of the center of this, mostly this like industrial zone right here, and like the center of the village, because this is where the Ukrainians have very strong defenses. And the Russians are assaulting the southern part of the town. So the Russians are, there's still battles going on here. But the main goal of the Russians here, as they're battling for these like small houses, is to basically reach this rail line, give themselves a defense point, so that then when they take this line, they could basically then use the rail line here as a natural defense point and to guard from the north as they take Grigorivka. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this last video, but basically now it's confirmed that the Russians have reached the center of Grigorivka. They've taken, again, like Peremyska, they have taken the most eastern part of Grigorivka, but now the center still needs to be taken. And again, like Peremyska, it's a bit hard because the fields are still under Ukrainian control. They're trying to solve this by taking Pojeba and advancing along these fields. However, advancing in the fields is very hard to do. Because of Ukrainian FPV drones. The same thing with with the Ukrainians trying to attack. So it's very hard. So the Russians can't, but the main goal of the Russians, and we can actually see it with the here's the Rybar map of the you can see that the southern part of the village is under everything of Krasnogorivka. Below the rail line is almost under complete Russian control. We can also see this here in let's see here. In here we can see that they are now reaching the center of Grigorivka here. And so basically they're using the reservoir as like a defense node here, like a defensive posture. However, again, the Ukrainians still hold this hill right here that prevents the Russians from reaching this reservoir, which allows them to then advance to this rail line. And basically they're using Grigorivka is basically the extent the Russians could do before they put themselves in too much of a salient where the Ukrainians could use these open fields to attack them directly. So, but the goal, once they take Grigorivka, they could then establish themselves along this reservoir and then establish themselves along this rail line. And then at that point, they could then begin operations to take Krasnogorivka. And I think that's what the Russians will do. The Russians won't continue pushing towards Karakova. A lot of people are saying, oh, they're going to take this, and they're just going to continue pushing. But that can't happen. Imagine they're trying to assault this town right here, the thing I cannot pronounce. And, this whole area is still not cleared. The Ukrainians will have a field day trying to attack them. And also they could attack them from the north here. That way, if they attack here, not only do they solve the problem of being attacked from the north, they also, could attack Krasnogorivka because, there's no way to, they have a lot of more secure areas to attack it from. And I kind of have this in this area right here. Let's go to Krasnogorivka here. So basically, this black line is the rail line. They're going to the goal of the Russians right now in this area is to take Grigorivka and reach this kind of black line using the rail line. And basically, from that point, use this as a springboard for part 2 of this offensive in the South Donetsk direction to push to this yellow line, using this river as a defense node. They're going to use this tree line to help defend themselves. The Ukrainians have this red line as this is not only where the Russians want to push the Ukrainians, again, along the Volchachka River, but this is where one of the biggest Ukrainian defense lines are. It's very strong here. However, the Russians aren't going to attack this directly, and they don't need to. They're going to basically push north from here and basically try to establish themselves along this river. The only problem I see with this is that this is going to be very hard to supply. They're going to need to take Grigorivka, and they're going to need to have stable supply routes to this area right here, because then the Ukrainians could just continuously attack them, and they're going to need to be very strong here. But if they manage to launch themselves along this yellow line, then they'll basically put the last Ukrainian supply route to Krasnogorivka under fire control. In fact, they might just start attacking it, take it and seize it directly, because these fields, the north of Krasnogorivka, aren't really as strong as the center. It's a bunch of little town, there's like some houses here. Obviously, it's pretty strong, but it's not as strong as like the center of the town here. So we're gonna see, this is what's happening in Krasnogorivka. They are trying to clear and take the southern part below this rail line. There's some progress there today. They are advancing along this reservoir towards the center of Grigorivka. But again, this is where the Russians are trying to outflank Krasnogorivka and force it to collapse. So, because again, this is still part of the whole save Donetsk operation, to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And in order to do that, they need to take Krasnogorivka. So I think once Grigorivka falls, I don't think they're going to continue advancing towards Karakova unless they somehow make a breakthrough in the South Donetsk direction. I think they're going to now focus on Krasnogorivka. So this is where a lot of progress on the Donetsk front. Speaking of the South Donetsk area, there's been a lot of progress in Novomikhailivka, and most of the village is now under Russian control. This week, we saw basically the center part of the town fall under Russian control. We saw the Russians hoist their flag in the Novomikhailivka kind of like government building here. We saw Russian troops in this this church right here. We saw Russian troops, occupying this post office. And so basically, the only thing the Ukrainians have, and not only that, we saw the Russians dismount and start doing attacks right here on the western edge of Novomikhailivka. And so basically we shouldn't be, with the center collapsing and the Russians now attacking the western part of Novomikhailivka, this town is basically done for. Now, taking Novomikhailivka is a good first step. However, that does not really complicate the Ukrainian positions. What will complicate Ukrainian positions in Ugledar is the fall of Konstantinivka. And I think this is the Ukrainians are trying to basically prevent the Russians from steamrolling and taking this village, but they want to have more time to defend themselves. And I think they have I think the Ukrainians have a lot of defenses here. It's not like once Novomikhailivka falls, Konstantinivka is going to be up for the taking. It's going to be a hard fight to take this town. And not only that, there's problem with the South Donetsk direction is that there's so much open fields here that it's very hard for the Russians to advance. And basically, the Russians will need to basically use these villages as cover. And basically, but the thing is, the more they advance along this, along the kind of like village hopping, as I call it, they still have these open fields where the Ukrainians could attack. But again, attacking along the fields is very hard. This area has been frozen for the last year, over a year, 2 years, and so this is mined to hell. This is trenched up to hell. It's very hard for the Russians to advance. The only way they could advance is along Novomikhailivka towards Konstantinivka. And this is the only way the Russians will be able to hold themselves, in defense. So Novomikhailivka, the center, has fallen to the Russians. They are now attacking the western part, and we will see how much longer it takes the Russians to clear up this area and before they start attacking towards Konstantinivka. Let's continue down here. Nothing changed in the Kherson direction. Nothing happened there. There has been some changes in the Zaporozhye front. Now, if we look at Rybar's map of Zaporozhye, we see that the center of Robotyne is still under Russian control. However, as we mentioned, this map, for example, just says that the southern part of Robotyne is contested, while the center is now back under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians also transferred reserves here, and they are still trying to prevent the Russians from, the Russians started their little Zaporozhye offensive like 2 weeks ago. And they managed to actually occupy Robotyne, however, or at least the center part of it. However, the Ukrainians do not want the Russians to, for at least for morale purposes, to push back all their progress from Zaporozhye. However, where the Russians have been more successful is basically retaking the first line of defense in the Surorovkin line right here. They are pushing the Ukrainians away from Berbova and basically advancing closer and closer towards the eastern edge of Robotyne. However, again, this is all open fields. And this is a very tough area for the Russians to advance. So, again, I think this is more of a pinning operation. I think the Russians aren't trying to make a big advancement, trying to break through here. But I think it's definitely they are trying to basically pin Ukrainian troops here from going to other more important areas like in Donetsk. But again, the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians away from Berbaba a bit, taking the first line of defense again and moving along these tree lines. So we shall see how that all plays out. So this is the battle of the fields around Robotyne. Still is ongoing. The Russians are now on, but however, the Russians are on the initiative here. But it's it's going to be hard, just like in the South Donetsk area because of the fields. Yeah, let's continue talking of, let's talk about Bakhmut. Now, before I talk about Bakhmut, that's basically the, let's see here. There was no changes on the Luhansk front in general. Let's just talk about this area. This is where one of the most quietest areas, and this might be where the Russians do a big offensive push if they ever do so in the summer. I think the Russians are gonna push in this area. Maybe, but that's just my guess. I don't have like any documents that say that. But there's been no changes on this front this week for the most part, or any part really. The only change really is that the Russians keep trying to enter Sinkovka from the north. They have some positions in the north of the village. However, the Ukrainians every week the Russians enter the northern part of Sinkovka. They get driven back out towards the forests, and then they enter. It's a game of cat and mouse, and it's like nothing's changing. So, the Russians are still failing to take Sinkovka. But besides the back and forth in Sinkovka, there's been really no other changes in this Luhansk front. Before we talk about Bakhmut, there's been some changes here in the Seversk front. The Russians are bombing, there's been some, between Vimfka and kind of, Visola and such, this is, again, open fields. It's very hard for the Russians to advance. The Russians have been using this rail line and advancing along it to defend themselves. But, again, the Ukrainians just as easily could launch attacks here. So it's very hard for any side to attack. So that's why the front's very stable here. But, the Russians are bombarding the southern part of, the southern defenses of Vimfka here, but with little advances. The Russians have had actually more advancements in Bilogorivka. And actually, the battle for the village might start again. However, again, what I talked about this village is that the Ukrainians have control over the more higher elevation hills in the western part of the village, and so even though the Russians have control of this filtration plant, they have control over the trench lines in the front of the town. They could assault the town if they want. However, the Ukrainians will have the dominant height advantage from having control over this hill right here, and they also have control over this hill right here. So the Russians could enter the town, but it'll be a very bloody affair. And so it's a tough nut to crack. So there's the battle for Bilogorivka. The Russians are slowly getting closer to the village and getting some better positions to assault it at a later time. But again, it's very hard for it's very tough for them. Yeah, so that's the Seversk front. Some changes with the Russians getting closer to Bilogorivka, but nothing much. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. This is the last place we're going to talk about today, and the biggest thing to talk about is the village of Ivanivska. And basically, most of this village is now under Russian control. The Ukrainians still hold positions in this kind of like little these warehouses right here, and kind of in this area, in this most southern part of Ivanivska. However, the center part of the town and about 2/3 of the village is under Russian control. Now, the fall of Ivanivska is a big blow. It takes the center of operations that the Ukrainians were using on this side of the canal away from the Ukrainians. However, just because Ivanivska falls, which looks like it will in the next week or so, that does not mean that the Ukrainians will fall back to the canal. There are still a lot of strong defenses the Ukrainians have. So let's look at what I mean here. Here is Bakhmut here. So just because Ivanivska fall, there's multiple strong points on this side. So this black line is the canal. This is where the Ukrainians are having their main line of defense to defend Chasiv Yar. Now, the thing about the Russian offensive toward Chasiv Yar from Bakhmut is that it's on an elevation. The Chasiv Yar is on a very much more higher elevation than Bakhmut. So any advancement from Bakhmut to Chasiv Yar means the Ukrainians will always have the heights advantage. And the only way they'll get defeated is when they're battling for local control of an area. The Russians need to take the height in that area that defeats the Ukrainians. Like, for example, when the Russians took the Popovsky Forest, right here, for example. The Ukrainian positions here, which were on a lower elevation, collapsed, and they fell back to kind of more reliable positions in this forest right here, in front of this kind of high-rise district right here, which is in a higher elevation than the Popovsky Forest. So the Russians, they basically are on a very, when they're trying to take Bogdanovka, when they are trying to take this, trying to push the Ukrainians towards the canal, they always will have to attack from a worse height position. This is why it's very slow. And taking Ivanivska is good and all, but again, just because it falls doesn't mean there's still a lot more to do. And I did this with these red circles here. First thing is that the first circle right here is what is a hill with this forest, which prevents the Russians from taking Bogdanovka, at least the center of the town, a village, because while the Russians are now better positioned on the southern part of Bogdanovka, the southern edge of Bogdanovka, the northern part, they haven't been able to take this forest, and thus they have not been able to establish local height control to be able to advance towards the center of the village. Along with this, the Ukrainians have on the other side of the canal an extension of Chasiv Yar, actually. It is a bunch of high-rise buildings, which gives the Ukrainians very much strong visual defenses in this area. And so, the Russians advancing towards this area will be in a very difficult position. And this gives the Ukrainians will use this rail line and this forest and this area to defend the southern part of Bogdanovka from complete collapse. There's also the Ukrainians also have positions in this forest right here where they have trenches. They also have trenches in this forest right here, because again, this is where it's a higher elevation than the Russians are in Ivanivska, and so these red circles. So just because Ivanivska falls, the Russians still have a lot of jobs to do. There's a lot of fortified areas here, because again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the Russians took Bakhmut, Wagner did, and then they stopped. And this gave the Ukrainians over a year, maybe a little less than a year, but they gave the Ukrainians a shot, a couple months, to rebuild their defenses in Chasiv Yar. And it helps that this is a natural geographic defense node, because this is in a higher elevation. So the Russians have a lot of jobs to do. But the Russians are making swift progress in Ivanivska, which is more on a lower elevation than the places the Russians have been able to take. So it's a game of kind of puzzle. The Russians need to take a local higher ground, and then they could take the area around that instantly. And then you restart it, because the Russians will always be in a lower elevation as they get closer to Chasiv Yar. The key, though, is that taking Chasiv Yar, if the Russians ever do that, opens up the gate to the main Ukrainian defense line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Toretsk, and so forth, because all these cities are in the lowland, while as the Chasiv Yar is in the high ground. So once Chasiv Yar falls, the Russians will be on the offense. Will be able to push the Ukrainians all the way back to these cities. So yeah, Ivanivska is almost about to fall. There's a lot of villages falling to the Russians. The Russians are pushing everywhere, but the Ukrainians are using their strategic reserves or strategic assets to try to halt the Russians, but that comes to a price. It's like using a credit card that you might not be able to get. It's like saying, hey, you could use this credit right now, but hey, you may or may not be paid in the future. So it's like you might be fucked in the future, or this might pay off in the future. So but there's risk to that. If you lose that risk, you lose, in the Ukrainian case, everything. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed my analysis for the events on the ground for this week. This was so I hope you guys like this video, give this video a like, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see videos similar to like this. So aim high and wander on.